All right, so welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be looking at some pretty interesting stuff going on with the whole Ukraine-Russia thing.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a lot going on.
And some rumblings out of Iran, too.
Right, and how these things might even be connected.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got this collection of reports and analyses that suggest some pretty serious geopolitical maneuvering is happening. And it seems like things could be shifting pretty dramatically.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's just dive right in, huh?
Sounds good.
Sunday, February 9th, 2025.
Okay.
The New York Post reports that President Trump confirmed he spoke with Putin about ending the conflict in Ukraine.
Interesting.
Now, this is where it gets a little
tricky,
yeah.
Yeah.
The Russian news agency TAS initially reported that Trump instructed aides to set up meetings about Ukraine.
Right.
But then they changed their tune and only mentioned Trump's claim of a phone call without confirming it.
Ah, so they're being a little cagey.
Yeah. And to make it even more interesting, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, he wouldn't confirm or deny the call.
Oh, wow.
He said that with all the different ways they communicate, he might not be aware of every conversation.
I see. So kind of a non-answer answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then we have Leonid Slutsky, who's the head of the Duma's International Affairs Committee.
Okay.
He's saying that preparations for contact between Putin and Trump are already well underway.
So it does seem like something's brewing.
It does, right?
Yeah.
So back to the New York Post article.
Okay.
They're claiming that Trump actually spoke with Putin to negotiate an end to the war.
Bold move.
They even quote Trump as saying that he thinks Putin cares about the casualties and wants the conflict resolved.
Oh, that's interesting.
The article goes on to say that Trump feels he has a better relationship with Putin than his predecessor did.
Okay.
And that he thinks he can end this war quickly.
Well, he's never lacked confidence.
And he's got a plan, or at least the start of one.
Okay, I'm listening.
He wants to offer Zelensky a $500 million deal in exchange for access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals and natural gas.
That's a lot of money, but also a lot of resources.
And in return, he'd offer security guarantees as part of a peace settlement.
So it's like a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. Now, we got to be careful here because the New York Post article is a little vague.
How so?
Trump's confirmation of the call isn't a direct quote.
I see.
So it's possible that journalists are misinterpreting things.
Makes sense.
It's also possible that the conversation was supposed to be confidential.
Yeah, at the request of either side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe Trump's disclosure to the New York Post blindsided the Russians.
Could be.
Now, beyond the official statements, there are whispers of a potential deal being worked on.
Oh, really?
A well-informed source in Moscow says discussions between the U.S. and Russia are in their early stages, but that the U.S. really wants to stop the fighting.
Okay, so what are they offering?
Well, supposedly they're proposing lifting sanctions, reconnecting Russia to swift unfreezing assets, resuming oil and gas exports to Europe.
Wow,
and even allowing repairs to the Nord Stream pipeline.
That's a pretty big carrot.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a big incentive to get Russia to negotiate.
Yeah, I can see that.
But there's a stick that goes with that carrot.
Oh, what's that?
The source claims the U.S. is also threatening all-out economic war if Russia doesn't agree to freeze the conflict along the current front lines.
Huh.
And that includes sanctioning anyone who trades with Russia.
Wow, that would be a huge step.
It would.
Yeah.
And it could have major consequences for the global economy.
Yeah, for sure. You're talking about potential global recession.
Exactly.
Shortages, inflation.
It's a risky gamble.
Yeah, and honestly, it sounds like a bluff.
Well, the source does suggest that Russia sees it that way.
Okay.
They think countries like China and India wouldn't go along with it.
Right. They're not going to just abandon their economic interests.
Exactly. And if Russia wanted to respond to this economic pressure,
they could shift to a fully mobilized economy.
With price controls, rationing, all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that would basically mean they're escalating the conflict in Ukraine to a full-blown war.
With the potential for much more aggressive action.
Right. So the U.S. might be offering a tempting carrot. But the stick
might not be so scary.
Yeah. It might be more like a twig.
Yeah.
And it's not just about economics.
Right.
Our source says that Russia doesn't trust American promises.
Which is understandable given the history there.
They don't think a freeze will address the underlying security concerns that caused this war in the first place. They want a full settlement based on Putin's proposals from June 2024.
Okay, so they're not just going to settle for a temporary fix.
No, they want a lasting solution.
Yeah, it's about more than just territory.
Right. It's about security, historical grievances, national identity.
Right. These things can't be solved with just a ceasefire or some economic incentives.
It sounds like Trump might have been trying to figure out if Putin's even willing to talk during that alleged phone call.
Yeah. And all his optimistic statements suggest he might have gotten a positive response.
Okay.
But things on the ground are much more complicated.
Yeah, it seems like the U.S. and Russia might be talking, but they're not really speaking the same language.
Yeah, and the gap between them seems huge.
So this is like a high-stakes chess match with each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
And the outcome
could change everything.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting that on top of all this Ukraine stuff, our source says the U.S. brought up Iran, too.
Okay.
Trump's looking for a deal to keep Iran from getting nukes.
So now we're adding another layer to these negotiations.
Yeah, things are getting even more complicated.
Now, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Right.
He recently said again that developing nuclear weapons is totally forbidden under Islam. But he also said Iran won't negotiate directly with the U.S.
Oh, really? Why is that?
He says they've been betrayed and lied to before.
Well, yeah, there's a history there.
So instead, he wants negotiations with other countries like Russia, China, and India.
Wow. So he wants a bigger table.
It seems that way.
This puts Russia in a pretty important spot.
Yeah, they've got a lot of influence with Iran.
Right. They could be key to making something happen.
So it's like this tangled web of relationships, and everyone's got their own agenda.
And sometimes those agendas clash.
Ayatollah Khamenei denies wanting nuclear weapons.
Okay.
But there are reports saying some Iranian military officials want to develop them.
Interesting. So what do we believe?
Well, our source thinks those reports are planted.
Planted by who?
Western intelligence agencies. Maybe even Israel.
So they're trying to sabotage things.
They want to stop any U.S.-Iran talks.
And maybe even push for a conflict.
It makes you wonder who to trust.
Exactly. It's all a big game of information warfare.
So let's say for a minute that Iran does want a peaceful solution.
Okay.
What could Russia do?
Well, Russia's tight with Iran.
Right.
They could use that to guarantee Iran doesn't build nukes.
And how would they do that?
Probably by offering security guarantees like in the recent partnership treaty.
So Russia's playing both sides.
They're in a good position to do that.
It sounds like we might be talking about a massive deal here.
What do you mean?
Ukraine, Iran, the Middle East, all wrapped up in one.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack.
Russia would be the mediator, and the U.S. would be trying to solve all these problems at once.
It's ambitious, to say the least.
Do you think it's possible?
I mean, anything's possible, but we have to remember there's a lot of tension and distrust.
And what about Europe and Ukraine?
Right.
They seem to be left out of these U.S.-Russia talks.
Yeah, they're not happy about it.
Zelensky's really worried.
I can imagine.
He's fighting for his country's survival while the big guys are making deals.
It's got to be frustrating.
He's warned against leaving Ukraine out of any peace agreement.
And he's asking for more military support?
It shows you how much power the U.S. and Russia have.
Yeah, they're calling the shots.
And the smaller countries have to deal with the consequences.
That's the reality of geopolitics, unfortunately.
Europe's also got their own problems right now.
Oh, yeah. What's going on over there?
There's political turmoil in France and Germany.
That's not good.
It weakens their ability to influence things.
Right.
Britain's trying to fill the void.
Really? How so?
They're offering to chair the next Ramstein meeting.
That's the meeting about supporting Ukraine, right?
Yeah, and it seems like the U.S. is taking a step back.
Interesting. So Britain wants to take charge.
It could be. They're just trying to stay relevant after Brexit.
Yeah, they need to show they're still a player on the world stage.
But do they really have the power to make a difference?
That's the big question.
Meanwhile, the fighting in Ukraine continues.
So despite all this talk, nothing's really changed.
Still a dangerous situation.
And who knows how it's going to end.
Despite the uncertainty, some things seem to be pointing in Russia's favor.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Their economy's doing okay, considering the sanctions. They're making progress militarily in Ukraine.
Right.
They still have influence in Syria. They're in a strong position in these negotiations with the U.S.
About both Ukraine and Iran.
Yeah, they're playing their cards right.
And there have been some developments that help them even more.
What do you mean?
That planned call between Trump and Xi Jinping got postponed.
Right, and it looks like a trade war between the U.S. and China is brewing.
Yeah, that plays right into Russia's hands.
It takes the pressure off them.
And gives them more leverage.
So Putin must be feeling pretty good right now?
I'm sure he is. He's weathering the storm, and he's got a potential meeting with Trump coming up.
It's like he's winning this game of chess.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
Wow. So much is happening. It's hard to keep track.
Yeah. Definitely a lot to process.
Secret phone calls, possible deals, new alliances, trade wars. Everyone in Europe's nervous.
Yeah, it seems like everything's changing so fast.
And the big question is,
what happens next?
Right, what's the future for Ukraine and Iran and the global balance of power?
And how do we even begin to understand all this?
It's a real mess.
It is, but I think if we want to understand what might happen, we need to look at what the main players want.
Their goals, their limits, how they react to each other.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that possible U.S.-Russia deal.
Okay.
What if those negotiations actually work out?
Yeah, what if they make a deal on Ukraine and Iran?
Could that bring more stability?
It's possible a good agreement could calm things down.
Reduce the risk of war?
Maybe even lead to them working together on other stuff like climate change or nukes.
Okay, but what if the talks fail?
Right. What if Russia doesn't take the deal?
What if they double down?
That could get really dangerous.
More military support for Ukraine, tougher sanctions.
Maybe even direct conflict between NATO and Russia.
That's scary.
It's definitely a possibility we can't ignore.
And what about China and India?
Oh, yeah, they're major players too.
How will they react?
They're both growing stronger, and they don't love the U.S. being in charge.
What if they decide to side with Russia?
That could shift the balance of power away from the West.
So this isn't just about Ukraine anymore?
Right. It's about the whole world order changing.
New alliances forming, old ones falling apart.
It's a time of big changes and big risks.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Think for yourself.
Don't just believe everything you hear.
Exactly. Question things, look at different viewpoints.
Because in the end, we all have to make our own decisions.
And those decisions will shape the future.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
If you want to hear more, subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear.